This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Richard Pound, affectionately known as Dick Pound. I could spend the entire rest of the meeting, I think, talking about his accomplishments. He's an honorary member of the Rotary Club of Westmount. He was born in the last century in St. Catharines, Ontario, and is a resident today in Westmount with his wife. Some of his accomplishments. Dick was an outstanding Canadian swimming champion and a prominent spokesman for ethics in sport. A staunch advocate of strict drug testing for athletes, and he was responsible for establishing the World Anti-Doping Agency, otherwise known as WADA, and served as its chairman until 2007. The man is a chartered accountant, I believe from Sir George Williams, if I'm not mistaken. He is a lawyer. He was the Chancellor of McGill University from 1999 to 2009. A member of the International Olympic Committee Executive Board from 1983 to the year 2000. 13 of those years was served as the Vice President of the IOC. He's been the chairman of the Board of Olympic Broadcasting Services. He was a groundbreaking negotiator for Olympic television and sponsorship deals and transformed what they called a cash-poor IOC into what today is a multi-billion-dollar giant in sports and marketing. That's a question I'll have for you later. A companion of the Order of Canada and an officer of the National Order of Quebec. It is my delight to introduce Dick, and we're very happy to have you here today, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jim, and many thanks for this virtual opportunity, although I must say I would prefer to have an in-person occasion, but thank heavens that Zoom was invented just before the pandemic, because otherwise we'd have had a much rougher time. I thought I would talk a little bit about the Olympics and sport in general. On the Olympic front, the last few years have been a very interesting ride, and we've still got some rough water ahead of us. But as those of you who've been around for a while will know, the Olympics have been canceled since their beginning only 3 times. Once during World War I and 2 occasions in respect of World War II. But they'd never been postponed until the Tokyo Games scheduled for 2020, right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And both the Tokyo organizers and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, were sort of marching along hand in hand, really like lemmings headed for a cliff, until finally it became clear that they could not be held during 2020. And the IOC was pretty adroit in creating the conditions that allowed the Tokyo organizers to say, look, 2020 is a non-starter, but if we postpone them for a year, we'll know more about the pandemic and perhaps have better data and more confidence about being able to contain it than we have now in 2020. So a decision was made to postpone the games for almost exactly a year, almost to the date, which sounds, doable if you think about it. But if you think about it a little more, it's a huge logistical nightmare. And I'm not sure how many countries other than Japan could have done what they did. I mean, the games were awarded back in 2013, and you had generally 7 years to prepare for them, and you need pretty much all of that to be ready. And so they were going along with all of the the construction and the making of commercial arrangements for the after use of the facilities and all of those sorts of things. All the tickets were being sold and the money collected for those. And it's really as if you're on an aircraft with a 7-year flight, and you're coming down through the clouds, and you can actually see the runway in front of you. And then somebody says, "Hold it, stop right there. We're going to postpone this for a year." And the logistical nightmare that created was astonishing. I mean, just if you think about people who bought tickets for the games and hotel accommodations for the games, as my family did, because all our kids wanted to go and see Japan and see the games and so forth. You pay in advance for them, you get the reservations and whatnot. And then all of a sudden, you got to shift this by a year. The hotels may have been, conventions and all sorts of things booked for 2021, and now that's not available anymore. So it was a huge difficulty. The workforce had to be, sort of put on hold. Many of the senior positions in the organizing committee were filled with very skilled and experienced employees from other businesses and entities and so forth. And all of a sudden that has to be put on hold. We weren't sure what the fallout would be for spectators. And in fact, we ended up basically with no spectators. At one point, the Japanese were thinking of just prohibiting foreigners from attending, but then as things got closer and closer, they said, no, it's too risky to have that many people in such close contact. So they were basically spectatorless games, which is not the end of the world. I don't know if you can imagine most athletes are focused on on their performance, and it's distracting to have family and friends around, and you have to sort of keep one eye out open for them and another focused on your sport performance. But in the end, and both in Tokyo and in Beijing, they created what were known as bubbles, where people could get into the sort of the COVID-free areas and participate, and then at the end of their sport performances, they simply left Japan to go back home. And the additional challenge was that with a delay of a year for the summer games, it meant that the winter games in Beijing, scheduled for February or so of 2022, were only 6 months after the Tokyo games, and you had to move all of the preparations and so forth from, fortunately, not too far, because Japan and China are pretty close to each other. But to get all of that in place for Beijing that quickly was a monumental challenge. And fortunately, the cloud technology allowed a lot of the media and television operations to move fairly seamlessly between the two. And for those who watched either or both of the games on television, it was a pretty seamless operation, and you would never have known that there were no people in the area. In the case of Beijing, they were a little more muscular in terms of their bubble. I mean, once you got into the bubble, and they put all of the staff and so forth in the bubble probably 3 weeks or 4 weeks before the game, so that you ended up with a bubble which is probably the safest place on the face of the planet in terms of of being COVID free. Right after I think within 2 or 3 days of the closing ceremony of the Beijing Olympics, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and there's a conflict, as we all know, that is going on, and there doesn't seem to be any likelihood that it will be solved quickly. It has caused a lot of friction in the world, a lot within the sport community, and the question is whether or not Russia and Belarus will be excluded from the games in Paris, and possibly even in the Winter Games in 2026 in Milano Cortina. And the IOC is caught. It's a very inclusive organization. We're trying to use sport as an enabler of peace and non-discrimination and so forth, which generally works pretty well, even if it's only for a month or two in the Olympic years. And that is very much in jeopardy as we speak. And the IOC has been walking sort of a tightrope of saying, we're not going to rule out anything yet because the conflict may end before the Paris Games next summer, or it may not. My view on it is, if the conflict is still ongoing, that neither Russia nor Belarus will be participating. I think that's just the aspirational goal and the political realities collide, and the political realities will triumph in that. It's a shame, but that's kind of the way it is. Almost everybody knows that boycotts don't work, and we were part of that. As some of you may recall, back in 1980, when U.S. President Jimmy Carter organized a very significant boycott of the Moscow Games. Everybody knew that it wasn't going to work, and if you think about it, what it says is if you're doing this to the Soviet Union of the day, say, we're so upset with your intervention in Afghanistan, and we're going to show you how upset we are. We're going to ruin the sport lives and hopes and dreams of our Olympic athletes, just to teach you a lesson about Afghanistan. The Russians were still in Afghanistan 10 years later, and it was known not to work. The Canadian outrage about that was so acute that we actually cut back the number of Aeroflot flights between Canada and the Soviet Union from 4 per week to 3 per week. We canceled a ballet tour. We destroyed a generation of Olympic athletes, their hopes and dreams, and all the work that they put into becoming Olympic type athletes. And we sold more wheat to the Soviet Union than we ever had in history. So that was the kind of the fool's errand that we have. And I think at least our government seems to have learned from that, and we're not talking about boycotts of Paris or anything at that level. Jim mentioned the formation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is headquartered in Montreal. It's an organization worldwide, and on a 50-50 basis between the sport movement and the public authorities. It's kind of a unique organization that had never been done before, and has proved to be a very good international monitor and regulator of doping in sport. And doping is the generic expression for the use of prohibited substances, drugs, and so forth, and methods such as blood doping and whatnot. Headquartered in Montreal, we thought it was a good idea to get some of the international sport mechanisms located other than in Europe, which has for many years been the center of international sport, and it's very Eurocentric, and we thought it was a good idea to create some distance, and there's nothing like an ocean between Europe and North America to establish that. We also developed what's now called the World Anti-Doping Code, which standardizes the rules regarding substances and methods that are prohibited, the regulation of that, the testing procedures, the sanctions, and all of those sorts of things that harmonize the rules so that they're all the same for every sport, every country, every athlete, every international sports federation. And that has proven to be very effective, at least on the sport level. But it doesn't work as well with the public authorities because they act in their own perceived self-interests. And you know, for example, they've never done anything with respect to Russia, which is a serial violator of the rules. And we're working on mechanisms to make that a little more effective. The code is always a work in progress. It's been revised 3 or 4 times since it was first created back in 2003, and we're getting better and better at that, and the mechanisms are better understood and implemented than they were at the very beginning. Our problem with the public authorities is that politics enters into what should be a fairly straightforward operation. There's a under the aegis of UNESCO, the public authorities have entered into a convention, but they are reluctant to take any measures, for example, against Russia, which is a serial violator of the code. The politics are such that they've never imposed any sanctions under the UNESCO convention against Russia, and that's something that we have to address. Issues that are ongoing include governance, for example, and the international sports system was set up starting in the 19th century, and here we are in the 21st century, still with structures that were developed along the 19th century lines, and with international sports federations and so on, all being private fiefdoms. And they don't welcome any intervention in their affairs on the basis that they are autonomous. But the outcome has been that there's been a lot of non-transparency in their actions. There's abuse, there's harassment, there's financial and organizational corruptions, and I think we're probably all at least vaguely familiar with what happened in the U.S. gymnastics, for example, what's happened in Hockey Canada, and many more. So these are models that are now being examined in a much more organized and clinical fashion, and I think there will be improvements in governance. In terms of gender equity, we have, at least in the Olympics, achieved equality on the field of play. Not yet in the organizational context, but it's growing, and there are target goals of getting approaching gender equity, and I think that will that momentum is building up, and I think we'll see that in the next few years. We finally achieved an understanding that current athlete or very recently retired athlete representation is important. The athletes are not just objects around whom the sport organizations are supposedly focusing on athlete-centric stuff, but the athlete representation at the IOC level is exactly the same as it is for international sports federations and for national Olympic committees. There are 15 spots for each of those three constituencies in the IOC, and certainly from my perspective, it's been a very healthy and welcome addition to the mix. And one other issue, there's people in sport are very competitive, and there are often disputes that arise, and the court system, in each country, it is not agile enough to deal with these disputes in real time. So the IOC created what's called the Court of Arbitration for Sport to handle disputes at on an international basis. It's an arbitral system. There's a New York convention that entered into by virtually every country in the world now, that will recognize the outcomes of arbitration in any sport. So it means that you can have an international system that actually works, because you can't have somebody who's eligible to compete in Canada but is prohibited from competing in Denmark or any other country like that, and that's been very good. On a national level, we have an organization that was initially funded by the federal government called the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada, where you can have the same arbitration process dealing with national or domestic disputes, which would include team selection, access to athlete assistance programs, how do you deal with the exercise of discretion by sport officials, and so forth. Works very well, handled by arbitrators appointed in Canada. So we're getting into the 21st century, not without the occasional bumps in the road, but we're getting there. So let me stop there, because the danger in something like this is that I end up talking about something that may be of interest to me, but not to any of you, and it's usually more fun for you to make observations or ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So Jim, I only have me on my screen, so somebody in the room at large needs to manage the traffic.
Okay, well, we've got Heather's going to take care of that for us, Dick.
Okay.
I know our first question is coming from Sam Watts. Sam, would you like to ask the question personally?
I suspect I can.
There you go.
Obviously I'm a little bit younger, but I've followed things with great interest, Dick, and I certainly have terrific memories of Olympic Games, and perhaps my first real strong memory was 1976 in Montreal. But I'm curious about, given that there's new ways of cheating or doping or enhancing performance, and these are going to continue to emerge. I don't think the technology is done yet. How do you think the IOC will manage to ensure fairness of competition in the future?
Well, it's a combination of first of all, the code is a living document. The so-called list of prohibited substances and methods, it gets reviewed every year by an international panel of experts who follow the literature, who were plugged in with the pharma industry to find out what molecules and things they're working on, and so that the list gets updated usually before the end of September of, for example, this year. We'll publish whatever changes are happening to the list, and they come into effect as of January 1st, 2024. Because something that may not be prohibited now, people who have been taking it, once it becomes prohibited, they have to stop. So there's a kind of a fallout period of 3 months to get off whatever you were doing that's now prohibited. So that in that sense, it's pretty good. The ability to test for substances and methods has evolved enormously, and so I'd say when we started off in WADA, we were probably 6 months or a year behind the cheaters. Now I think it can be measured in weeks. The tests are very accurate. We know what we're looking for and so forth. So it's there will still be cheaters for sure, but and one of the things we do at the Olympics is we keep the samples from every Olympic Games for 10 years. And as the science advances, we can go back and test some of these things, because basically who the bad guys are. You have a pretty good idea of what countries they are, what events lend themselves to the use of testosterone-based stuff. So I think there's a lot more confidence on the part of the sport community that you can control that. And with the 10-year window, it means you may get out of town with your Olympic medal, but we're there and we can get it back. And it as a deterrent, when you think you give up your athletic career and get into business, and you have a family and settle into your community at large, and then if it turns out that this was all a lie, that's a major deterrent. So by and large, I always say you win the fight against doping in sport if 99.9 whatever percent it is don't cheat, either because they know it's wrong or that it's dangerous, and some of these things are really dangerous, and you're satisfied that we'll catch the 0.1 or 0.2%, you kind of won the war.
Rod DeCourcy, Ireland, you've got a question, I believe.
Well, I noticed that Wimbledon announced yesterday that they're going to accept Russian and Belarus players this year when they had banned them last year, I think. And of course, I think there are at least 2 or 3 of them that have been Grand Slam champions in various things. But do you really think the IOC is going to ban them?
Yes. I mean, if you look at the sports that are allowing sort of the independent athletes, so-called, or neutral, or whatever it is, they're basically the professional sports. And they just that's a money play rather than a fairness and accessibility issue. And but as far as the Olympics are concerned, as I say, if this war is still going on, there will be no Russian or Belarusian athletes there.
Okay. I was just in Paris 2 weeks ago, and their preparations for the Olympics, they are banning any form of scaffolding in the city during the Olympics to keep it beautiful. So there's a lot of work going on right now. But Montreal could learn from that, couldn't they?
it's going to be an interesting variation on the the classic Olympic stuff. I mean, you have the opening ceremonies with all of the athletes on barges or boats coming down the Seine, as opposed to marching into a stadium. It's going to be pretty special. It's dangerous, as you know. Paris is not necessarily a safe city, as we've seen from some of the terrorism activities that go on. So as a security exercise, it's going to be a challenge, but it will be, as lots of things are in France, pretty special one way or another.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. Malcolm McRae, you're up.
Hi, Richard.
I can't hear anything.
I'm sorry, Malcolm, I muted you by accident.
Okay, sorry. Do you think with the cost of the Olympics that they'll ever change to a permanent site?
Well, oddly enough, you can raise money from television, sponsorships, and licensing and tickets. You can raise more than enough to stage the games without getting into the pockets of the host taxpayers. Where lots of money is involved is if you're building new facilities, and we do our best to say to the host countries to don't build anything new unless you need it after the games. That not everybody listens to that advice, but those are not sort of expenses of the games. They're actually investments in infrastructure that the country needs or thinks it needs going forward. But we limit the number of sports in the games. We limit the number of athletes to keep those costs down. We're working about how to use facilities. A boxing arena and a volleyball arena. You have the boxing in the first week of the games and the volleyball in the second week of the games. You can duplicate the facilities. The IOC now provides. Jim had mentioned the Olympic broadcasting services. We now, the IOC, pays for that. If you move the games around the world, sooner or later you're going to be in a country that simply doesn't have the broadcast infrastructure to produce the signals for all of the competitions, and so we've created this organization that we know we get, if it's cross country skiing, you get your Norwegian broadcaster to do that because they understand it, and so forth. Hockey and figure skating and things like that, Canada can do. And so we end up with the best technical facilities in the world with experts doing it. We now sort of containerize the International Broadcast Center so that we can assemble it. As soon as the game's over, we disassemble it and ship it off to the next host. And so there are lots of economies of scale that will keep the costs down. And we have a new system now for choosing our host cities, which instead of sort of just saying here's a list of what you need, we'll see you in 7 years, and you bid against that other cities that may also want it. We now we select by a process of negotiation. We help potentially interested cities or countries to understand what they're getting into. We don't insist on everything being in necessarily in one city in the host country. You can have it in different places so that you don't end up like we did in Tokyo, where in the most populous city on the face of the planet, with 25 or 30 million people in this city, building stuff in the middle of the city anymore. And so I think we've generated a lot more interest in various countries, and I think that will that will keep the specter of overspending and ending up with white elephants from occurring in the future.
Thank you. I have a question. At what point do you think that there will be 3 levels of competition in the Olympics? When we have male, female, and trans?
This is we've been wrestling with this issue not without a great deal of success for a long time, and part of the problem, in my view, is that it was all pale, male, and stale attitudes. But sport has always been a binary system. You're either male or female, and those distinctions are a little more subtle now than perhaps they were in days gone by. But there was a South African girl, Caster Semenya, whose testosterone range was well into the male range. And if she were to be in a race and they identified the particular distances that mattered, if she were in the race, the competition was not to see who would win, it would be to see who comes second. And so many of the sports have said, I'm sorry, we appreciate this. She's not doping. There are ways to get her testosterone level down without intervention and surgery and all that sort of stuff. If she can get that down to within the female range, she's welcome. But otherwise, the competition is not fair. And we're still nibbling around the edges of that. Some sports are have a male, female, and open category. And that's I'd say that's in the early stages, but I don't see the Olympics changing in the foreseeable future.
Any other questions? Peter Starr, you're waving your hand, I think. Unmute yourself before you.
I will. Dick, I have a question. Just recently in the news, we heard about Tara Davis Woodall, a U.S. long jumper who tested positive for cannabis. And her fine was, as they took her out of competition for a month, but they also took away her national title. And I'm wondering, here's a drug that's decriminalized in most of North America, and it certainly doesn't enhance your performance. So why would we have this big fine to?
Well, that's when we put together the initial list of prohibited substances, I think the IOC was a little worried about the message that would be given if you say, well, these things are illegal and you can go to jail for them if you're using them or distributing them. But it's okay for the Olympics. I think everyone was worried about that being an off message outcome. What we did instead is where these things, as you say, they're not, we talked about Ross Rabagliati, you may remember him from skier. So if you're filled with pot and you're saying, oh man, what a mountain, you're going to be part of it. So it really doesn't improve performance. So we now, there's now a range that can go from a warning to up to if it's somebody's dealing in the drugs and so on, up to the normal 2 or 4 year ban. And so I think that's a better way of handling it without having to go off message. When we talk to the public authorities about drugs in sport, I say, oh no, we understand, cocaine, marijuana, heroin. I say, no. What about sort of peptide hormones? They had no idea what all these things were. So we had to educate them as to what doping in sport meant. And so I think that's the best way of dealing with it. You can regulate it, but have a range of sanctions that are go from, a warning to a motion of censure, that sort of thing. But if you have the stuff, well, it's on the list in your system during a competition, whether you intended to dope or not, you had the benefit of that. And so you lose the result in that particular competition, but you don't have any ongoing sanction.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other hands up or anybody waving. So I think we're good here. Dick, thank you very, very much for joining us today. And as you said earlier, I'm sorry that we couldn't do it in person at Victoria Hall. We're still kind of working on our issues with that.
Yeah.
But always a pleasure to have you visit us, and I hope we get to see you again sooner. It's been a couple of years since I know that you've spoken to us.
Great. Well, many thanks, and I look forward to in-person encounters.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to go on with the rest